I have a question for you. When you show these techniques, with could you also tell us some defense lines with the longsword, please? How do
Sure.
you do you defend?
So there's two different modes that we think about in the defense of the longsword. There's the largo, the wide defenses. So those are when I have the weapon chambered in one of these places where the point is away. So here the defenses are either, if I'm receiving an attack, I'm always placing my weapon so that the defense is a simple crossing of the body. So I'm not putting myself necessarily in a middle place where I have to defend in all directions.
Yes.
So in this way, any attack that comes to me, I can defend just by extending from this side. So the core defenses from right shoulder are either coming to a half cut, making a full cut, or in certain cases, a rising cut. So our core sort of largo defenses there are here. So I'm making that half cut with a retreat. So if I've got this attack coming towards me, half cut and returning with a thrust, this is absolutely the fastest. Or if the weapon is coming from this side, I might be seeking to deflect that and send it past me. And sometimes that's moving in a continual motion. Okay, so especially if I'm meeting the upper end of the weapon, we're seeking to fully clear the weapon. And note here my footwork in the largo space. If the opponent is attacked first, then I am obliged in the true fight to reclaim some ground, to give myself time and safety. And so in each of these, I'm making always this little movement back as part of my re-entry. That gives me more time should their attack be a deception.
Yeah.
So by giving myself a little bit of time. Now, there is another way of defending, which is counter-attacking. And so these are sometimes considered, especially in the Italian tradition, are considered to be the optimal things. And so we have a few different ways there, which are that we counter cut or that we counter thrust. So often those are done from these lower guards. So there my goal is to strike into the angle of the attack with a superior angle in the time of the attack. So you can imagine here, my goal is to interrupt the attack with the strong of my weapon, gliding it aside to strike. Or here, making an angle that channels them into the weapon's crossbar and sets up my counterattack. So in the longsword we have, just to summarize, there are 5 core manners of winning the center. They are parrying. So that is essentially making a cut that defeats the weapon itself directly. Deflecting, which is to help, so this cut is coming from my left to my right. It is giving it an alternate force vector so that it misses me. I'm kind of helping it go in the direction it was going without involving me. Collecting, which is channeling it into the crossbar. Often we use this type of thing to enter. Counter cutting, so that is making a cut that has superior geometry, and counter thrusting, which is a thrust that has superior geometry. So those are the 5, my system, we call those the 5 winnings. And we can do them, I can do those 5 things from each quadrant against every attack. So I have to do 5 winnings from here, 5 winnings from here, 5 winnings from here, 5 winnings from here. That's kind of for the black belt level, so we say, needs to be able to do that against all the attacks, 5 winnings from each of the quadrants.
And how is the situation then of defense with sword and buckler in your system?
So we use, of course, the same concepts. I'm very universal and systematic in my approach. So we have those same ideas that we're seeking to, of course, parry, deflect. Collections are typically done this way against the buckler. So I'm pointing into the line of attack so that the attack is channeled down the length of the weapon into the buckler.
Yes.
Then I'm going to keep the 2 accompanied. Yeah. I can, of course, counter cut, and I can counter thrust. I think the most notable thing, and this is something that is I look at a lot when I look at different sword and buckler systems. In our approach and the way I teach sword and buckler, we keep the sword and the buckler highly unified with one another. So even when I'm moving in these big cuts, so one thing you can note here that's kind of interesting is that as I'm cutting through these large shoulder cuts here, I pull the buckler in so that I can bring the weapon here, but then the buckler comes out into the space first and I cut behind it. So I'm keeping the buckler out ahead of the sword hand so that the sword hand is protected by the buckler. Then when I'm even fighting in closer, I'll keep the buckler protecting the hand at all times through all of the cuts. So you can see I'm maneuvering the buckler here. As I cut from the left here, I can't access you because the buckler is in my own way. So I fold the buckler onto the back of the hand to allow the sword to come through. If I wanted to cut maybe up from this side, again, the buckler in its optimal defensive position for me is in the way. So I fold the buckler out of the way to allow the weapon to pass through that space. So the buckler is always staying, it's almost, I sometimes tell my students to imagine like they have some surgical tubing around their wrists. And so that keeps the weapons close together. Because one of the easiest ways in sword and buckler fighting, I feel, to take apart an opponent is if the opponent is exposing their hand all the time as they're cutting. And I know a lot of different sword and buckler systems from different traditions. They pull the buckler away in order to maximize reach and then bring the buckler back in. So they get this kind of buckler sword thing. The thing I find is that the arm and the hand are such easy targets that I'd much rather sacrifice a little bit of reach to allow me to always have the safety. So here again, I pull the buckler away, it's coming into that space before my sword is there. And in that way, I'm always getting like the massive hand protection that the buckler affords me. And of course, the maximum silhouette of the buckler. So in this way, or in this way, I'm always maximizing the amount of my body that's covered by the shield.
Yeah, very interesting. Could you tell us why the buckler is like shaped like that?
Right, so this is a concaved buckler. This one's well beat up. It's had, I think, about 25 years in my service. The concave, so in European traditions, there's many different shapes for bucklers, but this concaved one is designed to draw a thrust and bring it into the middle of the shield. So when the one challenge, of course, with bucklers and thrusts is that with a buckler that's shaped in the other direction, a convex buckler, then the point could strike it and skitter off and hit you somewhere else. Now, one way that armor makers, shield makers try to solve that is by putting a big lip on the buckler so that the sword channels, it hits the lip and gets caught there. But another way is to have it dished to the inside here. The nice thing that I like about this is that when the point is drawn towards the center, it's more in alignment with the bones of my arm. And so in that way, I can more easily push into the arm of my opponent. So if you imagine here, if I've trapped the opponent they've come into the middle of the shield here, when I push, I'm actually driving their arm backward towards their body. So by pushing towards their hand, I can actually collapse the defense of their sword and then enter in.
I have a question. Does Canada have the same amount of number of events as they are in United States or no, in Germany as far as sword and buckler is concerned, or sword and buckler is something on the side?
Sword and buckler, I think it's gaining more prominence in Canada. And, you know, the interesting thing about Canada is I'd say that it's probably, as in so many things, there's more interaction between Canadians and their southern neighbors than there is between Canadians across Canada. Canada is such a huge country, and so much of the easy travel corridors are north-south. So it's often, I spend a lot more time interacting with people as far as local groups when I'm not flying somewhere. If I'm driving somewhere, I'm going to be going down to Seattle or down to San Francisco or down to Los Angeles, because those are all on this kind of easy to access channel, same time zone, all that kind of thing. And that's really true for groups across Canada, but there's more and more interaction. I have study groups in different cities across Canada, but I do in the US as well. But sword and buckler, there's little enclaves of people doing sword and buckler, and I think it's gaining more popularity, more interest. There's something we talked about this last time, you know, something about what they feel like the knightly two-handed sword. There's certainly a lot more historical materials about the two-handed sword than there are about the sword and buckler. But for people who are interested in diving into historical sources, I think that some of the richest materials are available for sword and buckler.
I have another question for you. Excuse me. I have another question for you, Devon. back to the defense line of sword and buckler, it just came to my mind, this question is, would you defend more with buckler or with your sword?
I would defend more with my sword. So I would say that I think of my defense in this as a series of layers. So my first layer of defense is the weapon because it reaches the farthest. My second is the buckler. And my third then is some positioning of my body. So I might be, often I'm seeking to clear with my sword the oncoming attack, or again, to half cut or collect it. Then I might, perhaps in that situation, should the opponent cut over to the other side, I might choose to control that space of the buckler while I seek to come to another target. But the thing that I always am concerned about with the buckler is that because the buckler it doesn't have this capacity to channel an opponent's weapon. So if I'm seeking to control the weapon, the blade, it's so easy to deceive, or even for an opponent who's been parried on it, to take off of it into a new target. Whereas when I really want to use the buckler, I would much rather be placing the buckler against my opponent's hilt or against their hand. If I can control their hand or hilt with the buckler, then I can be cutting off their capacity to maneuver their sword into any other position. So again, I'm tending to be wanting to use my sword out here, channeling the opponent into the buckler. Then as I come in closer, now here, I can press into the hand. Now I have some freedom with my sword because I've cut off the angle. I've actually fully restricted their ability to get to me with their weapon by placing the buckler much more proximally, so right on the hand or the hilt.
Another question I have regarding the sword and buckler, please correct me, is this a European tradition? Can I say that what is this, 133, or what is the name of it?
Yeah, 133, yes.
Yes, 133, that people who follow that tradition, they keep the sword and buckler more together, all the more together, yes, compared to Bolognese tradition?
Yes. Yeah, so in the Bolognese tradition, which is the tradition that I am most connected to, we have this largo play, which again is where the weapon is clearing through that space, and we get this withdrawing of the buckler, kind of this action. And when we get into the stretto space, then we have much more of this unification. But in the 133 system, they do have withdrawn positions of the sword, but you tend to do almost all of your transitions out through this guard they call half shield, which is where the shield is covering the hand. And then all of it is done much more bind play. In fact, to me, the 133 system, which has some of these same terms, to me feels a little bit more like Italian rapier play than it does like Italian sword play. That's more the commonality as to like the rapier and dagger or the rapier and offhand. And it seems to really emphasize, and I think for good reason, in a one-on-one fighting situation in particular, you want to know where the opponent's weapon is. You want to be controlling their most direct line of attack. And even when somebody withdraws their sword, you can place your, if you imagine that we have, your sword down over here, I don't need to go down and be in charge of it. I can place my weapon here. Where are you going to go? You have to hit me, you have to come up into the space that my weapon is. And just like with the rapier, the 133 system emphasizes these positions where the lower body is pulled away and the upper body is extended forward. In fact, some people even play it as deeply forward as this, which you think of again when I was showing you the rapier techniques. It's the same idea of refusing low-line targets by pulling them away and maximizing the extension and reach and defense of the sword by pushing it forward. And I think one of the main things that makes the 133 system a little different is that the sword is a simple hilted sword, just a cruciform sword. So they stand a little bit more square because they want to be placing the buckler to be the hilt of the sword.
Yeah, that's very interesting. But you can do the binding in both systems, right?
Absolutely.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, I think that part of why the wide play persists in the Bolognese tradition is for a few things. One is context. So when you're in a tactical context, especially in a multi-opponent scenario, there becomes a greater benefit to moving the weapon in arcs, because I need to be threatening to people, to multiple people. As soon as I become focused, whether it's thrusting or half cutting in this way, when I become focused into this one place, I open myself up against more opponents. So I need to, this kind of action gives me a lot more capacity to hold off multiple people. Especially if I put my sword into somebody, I have to commit myself to this, to sending the weapon in and then getting it out again. Whereas in a cut, I can do damage to one person and still be ready to do damage to another person. And I think that to me, as I look at the 133 system, it seems to me to be more one-to-one fighting oriented, as the rapier systems are more one-to-one oriented. And the Bolognese system, whether they were truly applying it in a battlefield context then, the teachers in that time wanted to be teaching an art that they felt was more universal to battlefield combat as well as to dueling.
Do you have also convex shaped shields or bucklers?
We do, yes. Yeah, in fact, I'd say that's more the norm. I'm just a bit of a fan of this one. So the convex shields are the norm. There's also, certainly there are bucklers that had diamond shapes that we see in the historical sources. Square shields are very common within the Bolognese tradition. There's a type of shield called a targa, which is sometimes called a wavy buckler. And it's a square shield that has these troughs in it. And those troughs are used, again, to help channel and collect the cut. So that it's a little harder for the cut to escape or skip off of the shield and hit another target.
And why do you like this shape? Why do you like convex shape?
Well, I mentioned earlier about the idea of channeling the point. I really like channeling the point there and getting control of the arm.
That's right. That's right. And could you also show us the defense line of rapier? What do you do with the rapier?
Sure.
And yourself?
So with the rapier, the interesting thing here, especially if we look at how I teach in the tradition, in the Italian tradition, the defenses, there are defenses that we make that are parries. So I'm actually finding, controlling in this way. And we do that always when we're attacking. The first thing that you're doing is seeking to get this dominance of cover position over the opponent's weapon. And this means that if the opponent attacks into this direct line, I have all the physical control of it. So I can actually close the line or suppress the line much more easily than the opponent. I'm forcing the opponent to have to go around my weapon. You notice even here, as I'm showing you, as I bring their weapon around, I'm following and creating the same advantages in the other line. So the core approach in rapier, but I teach this with all weapons, it's really about getting this initial advantage, pre-parrying, if you will, so that I'm getting control initially. But if I've lost control, so again, we're almost always in the bind in rapier. If I've lost control, then I need to either come around and reacquire control, or I need to change the leverage relationship on that side. Now, the next side of parrying, though, and this term parry refers to this as well historically, if this person comes around to strike me, I'm not obliged to first oppress and then attack. That's sometimes called due tempi, two tempos. I can instead, as they come around, I can counter thrust them as my parry. So we could say that, if I show you from the side here, that there's 4 basic parries. So I've got this parry, this one, here, and here, okay, to protect the legs. But we can also say that I could have this parry, and even in going to the legs, I might be more inclined to still just withdraw the leg. And so you can see again, because of the canted single weighted posture of the rapier, I'm making it so that my front leg can be withdrawn very, very quickly and rapidly from that space. And so again, you can take a very aggressive mindset with the rapier where I'm getting initial control so that I'm setting myself up, always have a time advantage. So if the opponent seeks to attack my head, I can close that, or my leg, I can seek to close that out and counter strike simultaneously with their action. And then the other area of the defenses of rapier are, especially as we get into kind of this adaptive fight area, or sometimes in the deceptive fight, are those ideas of dodging and voiding. So I had showing to you, there are these different movements of the front foot and of the back foot that take me off the line and around the opponent's weapon. So again, when the weapon is not moving in arcs, but is moving in these direct straight lines, I suddenly have a new type of safety. Let's put this down so I can do this much closer, so that I can actually just come past the weapon. And this is no longer a real threat to me, because it's going to need to wind up if it wants to cut me. So it's not going to be able to cut me here. I've negated the thrust. In fact, by staying close to it, I'm even safer. And then we have the other side of that, which is that there are these voids under the sword, done with the lead leg, done with the back leg, in all sorts of different directions. So even coming through here, we're actually really striking underneath the sword. This is the passata sotto, the low pass.
And